Welcome to the debate. Is dopamine detox scientifically proven? That is the central question we are exploring today. We live in a modern world that is, well, it's profoundly flooded with hyper-stimulating activities, from the endless, frictionless scroll of social media algorithms and the rapid-fire rewards of video games, to the instantaneous gratification of highly processed foods. Our brains are just constantly bombarded. And in response to this environment of chronic overstimulation, we've seen a massive wellness trend emerge, widely known as dopamine fasting or dopamine detoxing.
It really has taken over the cultural conversation lately, hasn't it?
It absolutely has. Today, we're diving directly into the source material surrounding this phenomenon to examine a critical divide. Specifically, the tension between the psychological utility of this practice and the neurobiological inaccuracy of its foundational premise. My position today is that while the name itself is undeniably metaphorical and, perhaps a bit dramatic, the underlying principles of the dopamine detox are scientifically proven cognitive behavioral techniques that successfully reset the brain's reward pathways.
And I'm looking at this from the perspective that the entire concept of a dopamine detox is biologically flawed. It completely lacks empirical clinical trials as a distinct intervention. And frankly, it spreads scientific misinformation that can and actually does lead to maladaptive, harmful extremes.
Well, let's lay out the case for why this practice is so effective. When you strip away the internet sensationalism and the flashy YouTube thumbnails, the dopamine detox is deeply rooted in established science. Specifically, we're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and the core psychological principles of stimulus control. We know from neurobiological research that chronic exposure to high-reward, unnatural stimuli forces the brain to adapt. It does this by down-regulating dopamine receptors.
Right. It's the brain's attempt to defend itself.
Exactly. It's essentially sensory adaptation. Just like your eyes adjust to a blindingly bright room by making your pupils smaller, your brain protects itself from a massive unnatural flood of dopamine by removing or desensitizing its own receptors. That downregulation leads to a state called anhedonia. It's a baseline deficit that makes it incredibly difficult to find pleasure in normal, everyday activities. Suddenly reading a book or going for a walk feels excruciatingly boring. But abstain from specific impulsive behaviors for a targeted period allows the brain's pain and pleasure balance to restore homeostasis. Addiction medicine experts have found that deliberately removing these artificial dopamine floods gives the brain the necessary time to reset its baseline, which allows individuals to regain behavioral flexibility and actual control over their impulses.
The fundamental problem here is that dopamine detoxing is a scientifically inaccurate fad that reduces incredibly complex neurobiology to a catchy buzzword. Dopamine is an essential neurotransmitter. It is required for basic motor function, for learning, for regulating sleep, and for everyday motivation. It is not a toxin that builds up in your bloodstream, and it certainly cannot be flushed or detoxed from the system.
I don't think any serious practitioner believes they are literally flushing a chemical out of their blood.
Furthermore, as a specific standalone protocol, dopamine fasting lacks peer-reviewed clinical validation and standardized trials. But perhaps most concerning is that framing addiction or compulsive behavior simply as having too much dopamine entirely ignores complex neurogenetic realities. When we encourage the general public to engage in self-guided extreme deprivation based on a fundamental misunderstanding of brain chemistry, we see people pushing themselves towards social isolation, severe anxiety, and even malnutrition. We simply cannot validate a practice that fundamentally misunderstands the science it claims to be based upon.
I'll concede that the scientific inaccuracy of the name is a fair critique. We should definitely address the mechanism of action directly, because we're dealing with this deep tension between neurobiology and metaphor. The term dopamine fasting was originally coined by Dr. Cameron Sapah, a psychiatrist who explicitly stated from the very beginning that the title is catchy, but absolutely not to be taken literally. The mechanism isn't about eliminating dopamine. It is about altering behavior to prevent the brain from constantly downregulating its own dopamine production.
I come at it from a different way. If we are going to use scientific terminology to validate a behavioral practice, we have an absolute obligation to maintain definitional precision.
You mentioned that the brain downregulates receptors in response to excessive dopamine, which is true in the context of severe substance use disorders. But the language of detoxing implies you can just turn off the tap. In reality, dopamine naturally fluctuates throughout the day. You cannot fast from it. Even if you sit in a dark room doing absolutely nothing, your brain continues to produce tonic levels of dopamine just to keep you functional.
Which is exactly why the distinction between the types of dopamine release is so critical here.
Exactly. And low dopamine is actually the hallmark of severe neurological and psychiatric conditions, such as Parkinson's disease, ADHD, and clinical depression. To suggest to the lay public that we need to actively lower our dopamine levels is biologically dangerous. Plus, the experience of pleasure involves a highly complex cascade of chemicals, endorphin, serotonin, oxytocin, norepinephrine. Reducing the entirety of human reward and motivation to a single neurotransmitter is overly reductive and, frankly, scientifically irresponsible.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. The reductionism of the term doesn't invalidate the mechanism of the therapy. We have to differentiate between tonic dopamine signaling, which is that steady baseline you just mentioned, and phasic dopamine signaling.
Right, the spikes.
Yes, the spikes. If tonic dopamine is the engine of your car idling, keeping you alive and moving, phasic dopamine is when you slam your foot on the gas pedal. It involves the rapid, high-amplitude bursts we get in response to unexpected or highly stimulating rewards. The detox isn't trying to shut off the engine. It is targeting the behavioral triggers of those massive phasic bursts. By practicing stimulus control, physically removing the smartphone from the bedroom, using website blockers, or abstaining from recreational drugs, we are engaging in verified cognitive behavioral techniques. The goal is to stop turning to a highly pleasurable stimulus to distract from difficult emotions. And the anecdotal results are significant. When people engage in these structured fasts, they report heightened focus, greater mental clarity, and a renewed ability to enjoy simple things. The mechanism is real, even if the public's biological vocabulary is imprecise.
But we cannot simply wave away the imprecise vocabulary when that vocabulary is dictating how people treat their own mental health. The distinction between phasic and tonic dopamine is important, yes, but calling it a dopamine detox leads people to believe they are actively suppressing a chemical. If it is simply cognitive behavioral therapy and stimulus control, then we should just call it cognitive behavioral therapy and stimulus control. Rebranding established psychological tools with a neurobiological misnomer doesn't make it a new scientifically proven intervention. It makes it a marketing triumph.
I hear your concern about the branding, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because the packaging is trendy. If we look at the actual clinical data, there is empirical evidence supporting the components of this specific framework. Let's look at the research regarding social media, which is one of the primary targets of modern dopamine fasts. Studies have consistently shown that a strict one-week break from social media significantly reduces depressive symptoms and improves overall well-being.
A one-week break from anything stressful will improve your well-being. That isn't entirely groundbreaking.
Fair, but let's go deeper. The clinical work of Dr. Anna Lemke at Stanford University provides an incredibly robust defense of this methodology. She utilizes a 14-day to 30-day abstinence period from the patient's drug of choice, whether that is digital media, gambling, or highly processed food. Her clinical findings demonstrate that this specific window of deprivation allows the brain to overcome the acute withdrawal phase.
Ah, the pain and pleasure scale.
Precisely. In her framework, she describes a balanced scale of pain and pleasure in the brain. When we constantly press heavily on the pleasure side with high dopamine stimuli, the brain attempts to level the scale by adding weight to the pain side. It creates these neurobiological gremlins that weigh down the pain side to keep us balanced. But when the pleasure stimulus stops, those gremlins are still sitting on the pain side, which is why we feel anxious, irritable, and craving more. By abstaining completely for 2 to 4 weeks, the weights on the pain side eventually fall off. The gremlins leave. That allows the brain to actually reset its baseline. This isn't just theory. This is empirical observation of the exact mechanism the dopamine detox claims to utilize.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Evidence supporting general CBT or evidence showing that stepping away from Instagram makes you less depressed does not equate to clinical validation for dopamine fasting as a distinct, universally applicable intervention. The massive problem with adopting Dr. Lemke's addiction model for the general public is that it assumes everyone is starting from the same baseline, suffering from the same neurobiological excess.
You're referring to the genetic variance in reward processing.
Yes, this brings us to the science of reward deficiency syndrome, or RDS, pioneered by Dr. Kenneth Blum. It completely changes the paradigm. RDS is a genetic and epigenetic phenomenon that leads to a profound impairment of the brain's reward circuitry. Specifically, we are looking at carriers of the DRD2A1 genetic allele. These individuals naturally have a severe lack of dopamine D2 receptors.
Wait, let's back up so we are clear. You're saying that structurally they are biologically starting from a deficit?
Exactly. Think of dopamine receptors like catchers on a baseball field waiting to catch the dopamine pitches. People with this specific genetic allele are missing half their catchers. They exist in a chronic, baseline hypodopaminergic state.
So their natural resting state is already inherently lower than the average person's.
Precisely. For these individuals, their compulsive behaviors, whether it is overeating, pathological gambling, or substance use, are an unconscious attempt to self-medicate a pre-existing dopamine deficit. They are constantly trying to activate a reward cascade that is naturally blunted in their brain. For someone with reward deficiency syndrome, prescribing a dopamine fast might be entirely the wrong approach.
Because you'd be taking away the only thing giving them any neurochemical relief.
Right. Stripping away their coping mechanisms without understanding their genetic baseline could plunge them into severe psychological distress. In fact, cutting-edge research suggests that these individuals often require treatments that actually increase dopamine function. They might need specific dopamine agonists to upregulate those D2 receptors rather than restricting their environment even further. By prescribing a blanket detox to society at large, we are completely ignoring the profound genetic diversity in how human brains process reward.
The research on reward deficiency syndrome is absolutely fascinating, and it certainly highlights the immense complexity of clinical addiction. I grant you that. However, Dr. Blum's work largely addresses severe substance use disorders and deep-seated clinical genetic vulnerabilities. The modern application of the dopamine detox, particularly as outlined by Dr. Sipa, isn't targeting those severe clinical populations. It is designed for the behavioral addictions that plague the average neurotypical individual in the digital age. We have to look at the practical application of this tool.
But the average individual is the one misinterpreting it.
Let's look at how it's supposed to be applied. CPA's original protocol targeted 6 very specific compulsive behaviors: emotional eating, excessive internet or gaming usage, gambling and shopping, watching pornography, thrill-seeking, and recreational drug use. When the detox is targeted specifically at these modern algorithmic behavioral loops, it functions flawlessly as a method to build distress tolerance.
Distress tolerance being the ability to just sit with negative emotion.
Exactly. Distress tolerance isn't just a clinical term. It's that exact moment you're waiting in line at the grocery store, you feel a sudden pang of boredom or anxiety, and you resist the urge to immediately pull out your phone to numb it. You just sit with the mild discomfort. That's the brain recalibrating. This isn't about punishing individuals with RDS. It is about providing a structured intervention for the millions of people whose brains have been essentially hijacked by the highly optimized digital environments we now live in. It is, in many ways, a modern, secular application of ancient mindfulness and ascetic practices. For thousands of years, philosophical and spiritual traditions have recognized that intentionally stepping away from worldly pleasures cultivates inner peace and emotional regulation. We are simply applying a neurobiological lens to an ancient, proven human practice.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the actual real-world execution of this trend? You are defending the highly idealized clinical version proposed by one psychiatrist. But the reality of what dopamine fasting has become in the public sphere, the viral mutation of it on social media, is deeply troubling because it is entirely self-guided and fundamentally misunderstood biologically. People are taking it to maladaptive extremes.
You mean the productivity influencer side of it?
Yes, and it gets so much darker than just trying to be productive. If you look at the online communities that have formed around this trend, you see individuals attempting to avoid all pleasure. They are restricting their diets to plain water and crackers. They are refusing to listen to music. They're avoiding exercise because it releases endorphins and dopamine. People are literally sitting in dark rooms, refusing to look their friends in the eye, and eating nothing but unsalted crackers because they're terrified of a neurochemical. It would be funny if it wasn't so psychologically damaging. Some are avoiding socializing entirely because human connection triggers a dopamine release.
Those are certainly extreme interpretations. And I fully agree that eating plain crackers and avoiding eye contact is a severe misapplication of the concept. It distorts the original intent.
But those extreme interpretations are the direct, predictable result of using biologically inaccurate terminology. If you tell a layperson that dopamine is the core problem and they need to detox from it, they will logically try to eliminate everything that causes joy. This isn't ancient asceticism. It's a profound misunderstanding of human physiology that pushes people toward anxiety, severe social isolation, and actual malnutrition. Real clinical addiction treatment requires nuanced, clinician-guided habit replacement. It requires teaching a patient how to safely interact with their environment, not an all-or-nothing deprivation model that leaves them entirely unequipped to function in the modern world. Think about it like a beach ball. When you push the beach ball of emotion underwater through extreme deprivation, it doesn't disappear. It inevitably bursts back up to the surface with incredible force.
Healthy, naturally rewarding activities like exercise or connecting with friends. But the fact that internet communities misinterpret a protocol does not render the protocol itself scientifically invalid.
It renders its public utility highly questionable, though.
Perhaps. But when applied correctly, the dopamine detox is fundamentally about moderation and mindfulness. It is about setting smart goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. For instance, deciding to abstain from social media 1 day a week from sun up to sundown. That is a highly structured, achievable intervention that forces an individual to sit with their uncomfortable feelings rather than immediately numbing them with the screen. It teaches that distress tolerance we talked about. The brain learns that it can actually survive boredom without a catastrophic meltdown, and in doing so, the baseline reward sensitivity is given the opportunity to recalibrate.
But recalibration implies a return to a healthy baseline, which, again, assumes we have data showing that dopamine fasting achieves this specific neurobiological outcome. We do not have standardized, controlled clinical trials evaluating dopamine fasting as a distinct therapy. We have theoretical extrapolations from addiction medicine applied broadly to digital habits. And while CBT is effective, the strict abstinence model is highly debated even within the addiction community.
How so?
For many people, strict elimination creates a scarcity mindset that actually increases cravings. When the fast ends, the rebound effects can lead to severe binging behavior because the underlying psychological triggers, the stress from work, the unresolved trauma, the daily anxiety, were never actually addressed. The individuals simply white-knuckled their way through a weekend without their phone, experienced a massive spike in anxiety, and then returned to their habits with even less control because they feel like they failed. Without professional guidance to help replace those behaviors with healthy, sustainable sources of dopamine, the fast is just a temporary and often painful band-aid.
But that is exactly why the period of abstinence is so crucial and why it must be sustained long enough to move past the acute withdrawal phase. Yes, the first few days of abstaining from a highly addictive behavior are uncomfortable. That anxiety and craving you describe is the brain's neuroadaptation making itself known. The gremlins are pushing on the pain side of the scale. But if an individual can maintain that structured break, the empirical evidence from addiction experts like Dr. Lemke shows that the cravings do diminish and behavioral control is restored. Furthermore, this practice encourages individuals to actively replace those high-intensity artificial rewards with low-intensity natural rewards.
Right, the habit replacement phase.
Exactly. Instead of scrolling online for 2 hours, they go for a walk in nature. Instead of ordering hyper-palatable fast food, they take the time to cook a nutritious meal. This isn't a band-aid. It is a fundamental restructuring of how a person interacts with their own reward system. It brings crucial awareness to the automatic, impulsive behaviors that dictate so much of our modern lives without us even realizing it.
Look, I don't disagree for a second that swapping screen time for a walk in nature is beneficial. That is unassailably good advice. But my point remains. That is just healthy living. It is basic mindfulness and behavioral activation. Dressing it up as a dopamine detox to make it sound like a cutting-edge biohack is where the scientific community has an obligation to draw the line. It creates a false promise. It suggests to vulnerable people that their complex emotional and psychological struggles are simply a matter of having unbalanced neurochemistry that can be hacked or fixed by sitting in a quiet room for 24 hours. Mental health is profoundly more complex than a single neurotransmitter. By focusing exclusively on dopamine, we ignore the critical roles of serotonin in mood regulation, the role of our environment, our social support systems, and as we discuss with RDS, our genetic predispositions.
I think we have mapped out the boundaries of this disagreement clearly, so it is time for us to summarize our positions. I have argued that despite a name that relies heavily on biological metaphor rather than literal neurochemistry, the dopamine detox is a highly effective, CBT-based framework. By targeting specific, hyper-stimulating behaviors for periods of structured abstinence, individuals can successfully break the cycle of modern digital and behavioral addiction. It allows the brain's reward pathways to recover from chronic downregulation, building essential distress tolerance, and restoring our capacity to find joy in everyday natural rewards.
And I maintain that the biological premise of the dopamine detox is fundamentally false. You cannot detox from a naturally occurring essential neurotransmitter. The protocol lacks dedicated, peer-reviewed clinical trials as a distinct psychological intervention, and it risks oversimplifying highly complex neurogenetic conditions such as reward deficiency syndrome. Furthermore, by unleashing a biologically inaccurate concept into the wild, it actively encourages potentially harmful extremes, pushing individuals toward unnecessary deprivation, anxiety, and social isolation instead of providing them with nuanced clinician-guided support.
Despite our strong disagreements on the terminology, the branding, and the clinical validity of the specific protocol, it is clear that we have found a significant point of convergence. We both acknowledge that modern society is profoundly, perhaps dangerously, overstimulating.
Yes, there's absolutely no question that the constant barrage of digital notifications, highly engineered foods, and algorithmic instant gratification is taking a heavy toll on our collective mental health. We aren't evolved for this level of constant stimulation.
And we agree that finding ways to unplug, practice mindfulness, and reconnect with simple natural rewards is absolutely vital for psychological well-being. The value of this discussion lies in looking past the viral wellness buzzwords to understand the actual, nuanced neuroscience operating beneath them.
Precisely. The human brain's reward system is an incredibly complex network, influenced by genetics, environment, and an intricate balance of numerous chemicals. A simplistic fast cannot rewrite our biology overnight, but understanding how our habits shape our neural pathways is a crucial step toward better health.
There is certainly much more to explore in the material regarding the brain's complex reward systems, the true nature of addiction, and how we navigate a hyper-connected world. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence and form your own conclusion on the ultimate utility of the dopamine detox. Thank you for joining us on the debate.